The blizzard hit Highway 12 like something with a grudge. 56 Harleys materialized through the whiteout, engines screaming, headlights cutting zero visibility, and one rider slumped against the brother holding him upright at 70 miles an hour. Inside the Copper Kettle Diner, Clara Rowan was already turning off the lights when her 6-year-old daughter pressed both palms to the frosted glass and whispered words that stopped her mother cold. Dad would have opened the door. Clara looked at the patch around Maisie's neck. Worn leather, cracked stitching, a dead man's name. Then she looked at the wall of iron and snow bearing down on her parking lot. She unlocked the door. She didn't know she was unlocking something else entirely. Before we go further, if stories like this reach something deep inside you, hit that subscribe button and ride with us to the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Highway 12, because what happened inside that diner changed everything. The last customer had left 40 minutes ago, and the copper kettle smelled like burnt coffee and a decision that hadn't been made yet. Clara Rowan stood behind the counter with a dish rag in her hand and the kind of tired that doesn't come from one long night. It comes from 3 years of long nights stacked on top of each other, held together with stubbornness and the knowledge that a 6-year-old is watching you for signs of collapse. The register read $42 and change for the entire Tuesday. The propane bill was due Friday. The bank had called twice that week, and she hadn't picked up either time because she already knew what they were going to say, and hearing it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for yet. She turned off the counter lights, left the kitchen lamp on because Maisie was still at the corner booth, drawing horses in a spiral notebook with a purple crayon that was getting dangerously short. Outside, the storm was doing what Montana storms do. Not warning you, just arriving. Clara had grown up here. She knew the sound Highway 12 made before a whiteout swallowed it. It went quiet first. Not peaceful quiet, something is wrong quiet. The kind that made the hairs on your forearms stand up even through a flannel shirt. She'd heard that silence an hour ago and had already mentally recalculated how much propane the space heaters would burn if the power went, whether the generator would start, whether she had enough canned goods in the back pantry to last Maisie a few days if the road closed completely. She was good at calculating survival. She'd been doing it since the night 3 years ago when the state trooper knocked on her door and took his hat off before he even spoke. Mama. Maisie's voice came from the corner booth without looking up from her horses. There's a sound. Clara came around the counter and pressed her ear toward the door. Nothing at first. Then she heard it. Low, rhythmic, building from somewhere west of town. Not thunder. Thunder rolled. This was different. This was mechanical and massive, and it had a pulse. She moved to the window. The first headlight appeared through the snow. Then another. Then more than she could count. They came out of the blizzard like something the storm itself had been carrying. A convoy of motorcycles so long its tail was still invisible in the whiteout. They moved in close formation, the riders hunched low against wind that Clara knew from experience could push a grown man sideways. Their headlights swept the diner's windows, and for just a moment, one strange, suspended second, the copper kettle was lit up gold against the white dark. Maisie had put down the crayon. She was standing on the booth seat now, both palms flat on the frosted glass, breath fogging a small circle. The convoy wasn't slowing down for the highway. It was slowing down because something was wrong in the middle of it. Clara could see it now. A cluster of 3 bikes near the front had broken formation. 2 riders were flanking a third, and the third rider wasn't holding himself up. He was listing sideways like dead weight, and only the arms of the man beside him were keeping him on the seat. Clara had spent 11 years as an ER nurse before she moved back to Widow Creek to take over her parents' diner after her mother's stroke. She'd left nursing when Jessie died because she couldn't stand the smell of hospitals anymore, couldn't stand looking at the gurneys, couldn't stop seeing his face on every unconscious patient they rolled through the double doors. She'd traded her scrubs for an apron and told herself it was a fresh start and had spent 3 years not believing that. But her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The way she read that slumping rider, angle of the neck, the limpness in the shoulders, the way his helmet kept dropping forward. Her body cataloged it before she'd even consciously processed what she was looking at. Hypothermia. Possibly head trauma. Definitely not going to make it to the next town if nobody stopped. The convoy began pulling into her lot. Maisie, get back from the window. But Mama, booth seat, now. Her voice came out harder than she meant it to, the old ER voice she'd thought she'd buried. Maisie sat. She didn't argue. She understood her mother's voices the way children who've survived grief learn to understand tone as survival information. Clara counted the bikes still coming in. 20, 30. She stopped counting and unlocked the door. The cold that came through was immediate and total. Not the ordinary cold of a Montana winter night, but the specific cold of a blizzard in full force, the kind that gets inside your lungs before you've even registered you're breathing it. She had to lean into the door to keep it from slamming back against her. The first man through was enormous, not in a soft way. The kind of enormous that comes from years of physical work, from carrying weight, literal and otherwise. His cut was black leather over a thermal base layer, and the snow was packed into the creases of his shoulders like he'd been out in this long enough that his body had become part of the weather. The patch on his back read Ash Vow MC in a half-circle arc, and beneath it, a single line she couldn't read in the bad light. He stopped 2 feet inside the door and looked at her directly. Not threatening, assessing. "Ma'am, we got a rider down." "How long has he been out?" The man's eyes shifted. Just barely, just enough. He hadn't expected that question first. He'd expected fear, or negotiation, or a phone call to the sheriff. 30, 40 minutes. He went over a patch of black ice 20 miles back. We couldn't stop. Visibility was 0, and stopping the whole column would have gotten somebody else killed. "Is he breathing?" "Yes, ma'am. Barely." "Bring him in. Clear me that center table, the long one. Somebody find my storage closet. It's the door on the left past the pie case. There are clean tablecloths in there. We're going to need them for warmth. Does anyone know his medical history?" "I do." A different voice from behind the big man. The man who stepped forward wasn't the largest in the room, but the room organized itself around him, the way a room always organizes itself around whoever is actually in charge. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in the way that outdoor men get lean. Not gym-built, but weather-carved, like the cold had taken everything unnecessary off him over decades and left only what was load-bearing. He had a jaw that looked like it had been set against bad news so many times it had forgotten how to unclench, and eyes the color of winter river water, gray-green and moving even when the rest of him was still. His cut said President above the left breast pocket. Below that, a name tag, Vance. "Coulter Vance," he said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume. "These are my riders." "And the man coming through my door?" "Danny Reyes, 23 years old, prospect. He's been riding with us 8 months. Something moved across Vance's face when he said it. Grief or guilt. Clara couldn't yet tell which. "He shouldn't have been out here in this." "But he was." "But he was." They looked at each other for 2 seconds. The kind of 2 seconds that contain an entire conversation about responsibility and the cost of decisions made in the dark. Then Clara turned to the door. They carried Danny Reyes in like he was something fragile, which was the first thing that surprised her. She'd expected roughness, had braced herself for it, but these men moved with the careful deliberateness of people who understood what a body in crisis required. They laid him on the long table as gently as she'd seen paramedics lay down patients, and when his helmet came off, she saw a boy's face inside an adult's damage. Dark circles so deep they looked bruised, skin the gray-white of serious cold exposure, a long-healed scar running from his left ear to his jaw that told a separate story she didn't have time for right now. She was already at his wrist. Pulse is there. It's thready. She pulled back his eyelids. Pupils responsive. No concussion signs yet, but that could change. She pressed her fingers to his neck, his sternum, reading him the way she'd spent 11 years learning to read strangers' bodies in the worst moments of their lives. He needs to be warmed gradually. Not fast? Gradually. Warming too fast after deep cold exposure can trigger cardiac arrhythmia. I need the tablecloths layered, not tight. I need warm water, not hot, in whatever containers you can find back there. And I need everybody who is not helping to step back and give him air. The room moved. It moved immediately, efficiently, without argument. 50-some grown men, most of them carrying more leather and steel than any room in Widow Creek had ever seen at one time. And they followed her instructions like she'd been commanding them for years. Someone found the storage closet. Someone else was already in her kitchen. A third man was checking the generator without being asked, and 30 seconds later the light stabilized as the backup power caught. Clara only noticed all of this afterward, in fragments. In the moment, she had tunnel vision, the kind that had made her good at her job before grief burned it out of her. Her hands knew what to do even when the rest of her was still somewhere between shock and muscle memory. It was Maisie who broke the silence in the room. She had climbed down from the booth without being told to stay there. Clara would deal with that later. And was standing at the edge of the gathered men with her purple crayon still in her hand and her late father's leather patch hanging around her neck on a cord. Clara had threaded through it so it wouldn't get lost. Maisie was 6, and she had the specific quality of fearlessness that comes not from not understanding danger, but from having already survived the worst thing and coming out the other side changed, but intact. She looked up at the nearest biker, a man who stood 6'3" with a beard that had accumulated actual ice crystals in it, and said, "Are you cold? I can get you a blanket from the back. We have the scratchy kind and the soft kind. Which do you want?" The man looked down at her. Something in his face came apart slightly, not dramatically, just a small, controlled fracture in the expression that men like him had spent years constructing and maintaining. He crouched down to her level, which meant this mountain of a person folding himself in half to meet a 6-year-old's eyes. "The soft kind, if you don't mind, little bit." "I don't mind," Maisie said seriously, already heading toward the back. "My dad used to say being cold is just being lonely on the outside." The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Clara heard it happen, felt the texture of the silence change, even with her back turned and her hands still on Danny Reyes. She couldn't stop to understand it. She filed it away. In the next 20 minutes, the copper kettle became something it had never been. A field hospital, a warming station, a strange temporary truce between a world that feared these men and the men who had long since stopped expecting anything different. Clara moved between Danny and the other riders who were showing early cold signs. 3 of them, though they hadn't volunteered the information, and she'd had to notice it herself in the way they held their hands. The tremors they were trying to hide in their shoulders, the slight slurring in one man's words when he answered a question. She directed each of them to a booth, wrapped them without ceremony, gave instructions in the same flat, competent voice she'd used in the ER when she couldn't afford to register the wrongness of what she was dealing with. Vance watched her from across the room, not hovering, not interfering, watching the way a commanding officer watches someone competent handle a situation, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned when to stay out of the way. At some point, the power flickered and then held, and the storm outside seemed to tighten against the windows like it was leaning in. At some point, someone produced a thermos, and Clara discovered her coffee urn was already running and didn't remember starting it. At some point, Maisie had returned with blankets for every man in the room who didn't already have one and had somehow appointed herself the person in charge of distributing them. And nobody, not one of the Ash Vow MC's battle-worn membership, had argued with her about this assignment. Danny Reyes's color was coming back. Slowly, the thready pulse steadying. Clara finally stepped back from the table and let herself breathe. She became aware for the first time that her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the coming down of the clinical detachment that had carried her through the last 40 minutes, the cracking of the professional distance she'd thrown up between herself and the situation, the way she used to throw it up between herself and dying strangers. Only these weren't dying strangers anymore. These were men in her diner with ice in their beards, asking her daughter which blanket she'd recommend. Vance appeared beside her. He set a cup of coffee on the counter in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "He's going to make it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Because of you." She picked up the coffee, set it down again. "Don't. I didn't do anything heroic. I did what I was trained to do, what I used to do." "Used to?" She looked at him sideways. "I'm a diner owner." "Tonight you weren't." She had no answer for that, so she didn't offer one. A long moment passed. Outside, the wind found a gap in the window frame and tested it, making the glass tremble. "How long have you been out here?" Vance asked. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the diner, at the walls, the old photographs, the handwritten specials board, the booth where Maisie had been drawing horses 2 hours ago. 3 years. After my... She stopped. After. I came back to run this place. My parents built it. Alone? Maisie and me. He nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something rather than told him something new. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing you might not notice unless you were watching for it. And Clara had been reading people in crisis long enough to notice small things. Mr. Vance, Coulter. Coulter. She said at once, testing the weight. You said someone forced your convoy into the storm, tonight. The stillness he had, that particular quality of controlled stillness, sharpened. It was the only word for it, like something behind his eyes had gone very quiet and very alert at the same time. I did say that. What does that mean? He picked up his own coffee, held it without drinking. It means we weren't supposed to be on Highway 12 tonight. We had a route. Something changed the route, and whoever changed it knew what this storm was going to do to an open highway. Someone tried to... I don't know what someone tried to do. His voice was even, careful. I know what happened. I don't know the why yet. Clara looked at him, and he looked at the window, and outside the blizzard pressed itself against the glass with patient, indifferent force. She almost asked the next question. She almost said, Are you in danger? Are we in danger? Should I be loading my daughter into my truck right now? She had the words formed and ready. Then Maisie appeared between them, carrying the short purple crayon and her spiral notebook and wearing the leather patch outside her sweater where it caught the lamplight. And Coulter Vance went absolutely, completely still. Not the controlled stillness he'd been carrying all evening. Something else. Something that went through him like current through old wire, visible even through the leather and the self-containment, visible in the single locked breath, and the way his hand stopped moving mid-motion toward the coffee cup and just stopped. His eyes were fixed on the patch. Clara felt the air in the room change. She felt it the way she'd always felt bad news arriving. The specific atmospheric pressure shift that preceded the worst moments, the ones you spent the rest of your life organizing time around. Where, Coulter Vance said very quietly. Did she get that? Clara's hand went to her daughter's shoulder without thinking. Old instinct, protective positioning. It was her father's, she said. Vance raised his eyes from the patch to Clara's face, and what she saw there was something she hadn't expected from any of the rough, exhausted, weather-beaten men who had taken over her diner tonight. She hadn't expected what she saw there to be grief, not fresh grief. The older kind. The kind that has been living in someone for years and has learned to stay quiet most of the time and only shows itself when something unlocks it without warning. Her father, he repeated, Jesse Rowan. He died 3 years ago on this highway. She kept her voice level. She'd learned to say it level. Truck collision. They said the road, I know how they said it happened. The sentence fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward, and Clara Rowan felt the floor shift under everything she thought she knew about the worst night of her life. What do you mean? She said. You know how they said it happened? Coulter Vance looked at her and at the patch around her daughter's neck, and at the wedding ring she still wore on her left hand, and the silence stretched between them across 3 years and a highway, and a death that was beginning right now, in this diner, in this storm, to look like something other than what she had been told it was. He opened his mouth to answer her, and every light in the copper kettle went out. The darkness came down complete, not the gradual dimming of a failing bulb or the flicker and recover of an overloaded circuit. This was instantaneous and total. One moment the copper kettle existed in the amber warmth of its backup generator, and the next it was gone, swallowed whole, and the only light left in the world was the blue-white fracturing of the blizzard against the windows and the faint ember glow of 2 cigarettes someone had been smoking near the door. Nobody screamed. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then the room exhaled, and the sounds of 50-plus men shifting their weight in darkness filled the diner like something alive. The creak of leather, the scrape of boot heels on linoleum, the low murmur of voices finding each other in the black. Generator. Vance's voice. Flat. Already moving. On it. 2 voices at once, from separate corners, the overlap of men used to answering the same call simultaneously. Clara had already gone behind the counter by feel. She knew this diner the way she knew her own hands, had navigated it blind in the 3 a.m. dark more times than she could count. Her fingers found the flashlight she kept zip-tied to the underside of the register shelf. She had it lit in 4 seconds. She swept it toward the table where Danny Reyes was laid out. He was still there, still breathing. The man she'd assigned to watch him, a thick-necked rider who'd introduced himself only as Preach, which she suspected was not his given name, was already at his side, one hand on Danny's wrist, already reading the pulse she'd shown him how to find. "Still steady," Preach said. "Good." Clara moved the beam toward the back. "Maisie, here." Her daughter's voice came from directly beside her left knee, close enough that Clara nearly knocked her with the flashlight sweep. Maisie had materialized in the dark without making a sound, and was standing pressed against the counter with her notebook clutched to her chest and her expression completely serious. Not frightened, serious. There was a difference, and the difference had always made Clara's heart do a complicated thing she didn't have language for. "Stay right here." "I know, Mama." From outside came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Clara caught it under the wind, a mechanical whine, high and brief, like something electrical shorting out. She looked toward the windows but saw only her own flashlight reflection and the snow pressing against the glass. "What killed the generator?" she asked the room. "That's what we're finding out." Vance had reappeared at her shoulder so quietly she hadn't tracked him crossing the room, which should have alarmed her and instead just felt like one more disorienting piece of a night that had stopped following normal rules an hour ago. He had a headlamp out, the serious outdoorsman kind, not the dollar store variety, strapped over his forehead, its beam cutting a clean white line through the dark. "Stay inside." "This is my building." "I know it is." He didn't argue further. He just looked at her for one beat with those river water eyes, and then moved toward the back door, and two men materialized from the dark to flank him without being called, and the three of them went through the kitchen and out into the storm before Clara had fully processed objecting. She stood in the dark diner with a flashlight and 50 strangers, and her 6-year-old daughter, and the sound of the blizzard eating the world outside, and she thought, 3 hours ago I was turning off the lights and going over the propane bill. Then she stopped thinking about that, and went to check on Danny Reyes. He was warmer than he'd been. Not warm, but the grayness in his skin had retreated slightly, the way tide retreats, and his breathing had lost the shallow, irregular quality that had worried her most in the first 20 minutes. Preach tracked her with his eyes as she worked, not speaking, not getting in the way, just present in the specific way that men who've spent years managing crisis learn to be present, available, but not cluttering the space. "You ride with them long?" she asked, not because she needed to know, but because she needed the room to have sound in it. 11 years. "Danny?" 8 months. Preach's jaw tightened slightly. "Kid came to us out of Billings. No family. Just a backpack and a busted-up Honda that he'd ridden 300 miles in December." A pause. "Coulter let him sleep in the garage the first 2 weeks. Never mentioned it. Just left the side door unlocked." Clara said nothing. She adjusted the layering of tablecloths over Danny's torso. "He's going to have questions," Preach said, "when he wakes up. About tonight." "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when someone tells you the route change that nearly killed you wasn't an accident." She stopped adjusting the tablecloths. "He knows about that?" "He will." Preach looked at his hands. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles, in the specific pattern of someone who had thrown punches in the past, and not always regretted it, but they were resting in his lap right now with a gentleness that contradicted the record those scars suggested. Danny was the one who flagged it, 20 miles back before he went down. He rode up alongside me and said the GPS reroute came through on the club channel, and it felt wrong. Said the signature didn't match dispatch. He paused. Then the ice patch. "You think it was deliberate?" "I think Coulter thinks it was deliberate, and Coulter has been wrong about things before, but not about things like this." The back door opened. Cold air moved through the kitchen like an announcement, and then Vance came back through with snow on his shoulders and his headlamp still lit, and an expression that had gone somewhere Clara hadn't seen it go yet. Not the controlled watchfulness he'd been carrying all evening, but something tighter. Something that had resolved from uncertainty into a specific and unpleasant conclusion. He came directly to where she was standing by Danny's table. "Sabotage," he said. Flat, not a question. She waited. "Someone cut the external power connection. Clean cut, not weather damage. The generator's fine, the fuel line's fine. Someone got to the junction box sometime before we arrived." His eyes moved to the windows. "They knew we were coming here." The room had gone the particular quality of still that large groups of people achieve when they are all listening to one conversation and pretending not to. Clara could feel it. All that attention concentrated in the dark. All those men who had been eating her food and accepting her daughter's blankets now realigned around this single point of information. How could they know you were coming here? She asked. You said the route was changed. You didn't know you'd end up here. No, Vance said. We didn't. That hung in the air for 3 full seconds. Which means, said a voice from the back, different voice, harder, with an edge to it. Either someone knew what route we'd take if we got pushed off the original one, or someone's been inside our communications tonight. The man who'd spoken was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his cut pulled tight. He was younger than Vance by a decade, but wore his years differently. Not weathered, just compressed, like everything he'd experienced had been packed down into a denser form. His patch said Sergeant at Arms. His name tag said Briggs. He'd been silent for the entire time Clara had been operating on Danny, which had made her trust him slightly less than the others, because in her experience, the ones who stayed silent when everyone else was responding were either the most controlled or the most dangerous, and she hadn't yet determined which category Briggs occupied. Nobody has been inside our communications, Vance said. His voice had a specific quality when he said it. Not denial, but warning. The kind of warning that says this conversation is about to go somewhere I'm not ready for it to go yet. We don't know that. Briggs didn't move from the wall. We know the route changed. We know the change came through the club channel. We know it pushed us onto a road that put Danny on the ground and pushed us into the only diner in 30 miles at exactly the moment when the power gets cut. He let each point land separately, like stones. What I don't know is how we're going to sit here and say we know our comms are clean. Briggs. One word, a threshold. I'm saying what everyone in this room is thinking. Then say it quieter. Briggs looked at Clara. Not hostile, evaluating. No offense, ma'am. Some taken, Clara said, but keep going. That surprised him. She watched it register on his face, the recalibration, the slight shift in how he was holding himself. She'd spent 11 years in ERs and 3 years running a diner alone in a small Montana town. She was not unfamiliar with rooms that needed someone to hold their shape. We have a leak, Briggs said, or we have an enemy smart enough that it looks like we have a leak. Either way, we don't go anywhere until we know which. The room absorbed this. Outside, the storm ran its hand along the roof with a sound like something trying to find a way in. My power line, Clara said. Does it tell you when they cut it? Vance looked at her. The box is on the east side of the building. There's a floodlight above it. Motion sensitive, battery powered, separate circuit. If someone came in from the road, they'd have triggered it. She looked at Vance. Did you check the camera? A beat of silence. You have a camera on the box? I've been running a diner alone in an isolated location for 3 years, she said. Yes, I have a camera on the box. Something moved through Vance's face. It might have been the beginning of a different kind of respect. The kind that comes from recognizing someone as a specific and competent version of themselves rather than a general category of person. He looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the 2 men nearest the kitchen door. They went without being told. In the interim, Clara went to the storage laptop she kept for inventory, old, slow, running on its own battery, and pulled up the exterior camera feed. The motion-triggered file from the last 2 hours was small. She opened it. The first segment was the convoy arriving. A solid 40 seconds of headlights and snow and the shapes of men dismounting in the dark. The second segment was shorter. 90 seconds before the convoy's arrival, the floodlight had triggered on the east side of the building. The camera showed a single figure in a dark jacket moving along the wall toward the junction box. Face obscured by a hood and the angle of the shot. But the movement was purposeful and unhurried. Someone who knew exactly where they were going and how long they had to get there. The figure spent 40 seconds at the box, then walked back along the wall and was gone. Clara turned the laptop toward Vance without speaking. He watched the footage once, then again. On the second viewing, he stopped it on the frame where the figure's jacket was most visible, and he leaned forward slightly, and his whole body did a thing that Clara had no way to interpret yet. A kind of weight shift that suggested recognition, fighting with disbelief. You know them, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He straightened up and closed the laptop and handed it back to her with a care that was at odds with everything else happening in the room. "Play that for no one else tonight," he said quietly. "Tell me why." "Because I'm not sure yet, and I need to be sure before I say a name in front of my people." She held the laptop against her chest and looked at him. "Are we in danger, right now, in this building?" "I don't know." "My daughter is in this building." "I know." He held her gaze, and she understood somehow that the steadiness in his eyes wasn't the steadiness of someone who didn't feel fear. It was the steadiness of someone who had learned a long time ago to function inside it. "I have men on every door. Nobody is coming in or out without my knowing. Whatever this is, it came before we got here. Right now, in this room, you're as safe as I can make you." She believed him. She wasn't entirely comfortable with how readily she believed him, but she believed him. Then Maisie, who had been sitting in the booth behind her with the spiral notebook, said, "The man in the picture had the same boots as the man who came to look at the diner last week." The silence that followed was of a different quality than all the silences that had preceded it. Clara turned. "What?" "The man in the camera. He had those boots with the silver piece on the side." Maisie pointed at the closed laptop with her crayon. "The same as the man who came and said he wanted to buy our diner, and you said no, and he said you'd be sorry." Clara felt the cold that had nothing to do with the blizzard. Vance had gone completely still. "Who came to buy the diner?" His voice was careful in the way that blades are careful, precise, controlled, dangerous in exact proportion to how controlled it was. "His name was Aldrich Marsh," Clara said slowly. "He's a land developer out of Bozeman. Been trying to acquire property along this stretch of highway for 2 years. Gas station, the old Perkins place, the Henderson Ranch." She paused. "He came here 6 weeks ago with paperwork already drawn up. Said the copper kettle was sitting on a right-of-way he needed and that I should take his offer before it stopped being an offer." "What did you tell him?" "What I told him is not fit for my daughter's ears." She looked at the window. "He left. But last week my attorney called and said Marsh had filed some kind of preliminary injunction claiming my father's original land deed had a title defect. My attorney says it's nonsense, but pursuing it would cost money I don't—" She stopped. "Money I don't have." The pieces were assembling themselves in the room without anyone directing them, the way puzzle pieces will sometimes orient themselves through simple proximity. She could feel everyone doing it, the quiet mental arithmetic of motive and method, the specific calculation that began with "Why would someone want us on this road tonight?" and pass through. How does a man who wants this land connect to a biker convoy in a blizzard and arrived at a question she didn't have the full shape of yet? Vance had his phone out. The service was bad. It had been bad since the convoy arrived, the storm eating the signal. But he was looking at something he'd already loaded, a file or an image or a document cached before the road took the bars away. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, without looking up, "Jesse." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped from a height. Clara's chest did something she'd trained herself not to let happen in front of people, a seizing contraction. Quick and violent and invisible if you didn't know to look for it. She'd trained herself well. Nobody who didn't know her would have seen it. But Vance looked up from his phone at exactly the wrong moment, and he saw it. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it, the way people mean things when they're already past the point of apology being adequate. "I should have. There's a right way to do this, and this isn't it, and I'm doing it badly." "Do it any way you need to," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were at her sides and she was keeping them there deliberately. He set the phone face down on the counter. Took a breath. The kind of breath that precedes something that has needed to be said for years and hasn't found its moment until now. "Jesse Rowan saved 11 of my men's lives on Highway 12 4 years ago," he said, "before the crash that killed him. There was a jackknifed fuel tanker. August, dry summer, the thing went sideways across both lanes and caught fire. We were in the middle of the column, no warning, no time. Jesse was driving a pickup going the opposite direction. He pulled into the median, laid down road flares to stop oncoming traffic, then went back into the fire twice to pull riders off their bikes before the tank could blow." Clara wasn't breathing. She was aware of not breathing and couldn't do anything about it. "He never told us his name. By the time the emergency services arrived, he was back in his truck. We got a partial plate. It took us 8 months to find him." Vance picked up his phone again, turned it over, set it back down. When we did, he didn't want anything. He didn't want recognition. He said he was just in the right place. We tried to pay him back. He said no. We tried to establish contact with his family afterward, when he died. He stopped. His jaw worked once. We were told his family was being handled, that there was a fund, that his wife had chosen privacy and the arrangement was working. Something cold and specific moved through Clara Rowan. What arrangement? She said very quietly. The death benefit. It was supposed to be $5,000 a month, for life. Vance's eyes were steady on hers, and the steadiness was doing enormous work, holding steady against something that wanted to break through it. We set it up through an attorney, a man named Galveston. He handled the transfers, he handled contact, he reported back to us every quarter that Jesse's family was settled and doing well, and that Mrs. Rowan preferred no personal contact. The room had gone so still that Clara could hear the snow against the windows. Coulter, she said, and her voice was someone else's voice, controlled and remote and operating from a place she only ever reached when she was holding something too large to hold and had no choice but to hold it anyway. I received one payment, $4,000, 2 weeks after Jesse's funeral, and then nothing. No attorney ever contacted me, no arrangement, no fund. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the gap between those two things, the fund that had been running for 3 years and the widow who had been losing the diner for 3 years, opened in the room like a physical thing, like a wound. I filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago. I used Jesse's life insurance to make the mortgage payments for a year, and then I lost that too, and I've been running on the diner's revenue ever since, which this past year has been between $40 and $90 a day. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't let it shake. So whoever told you his family was settled and doing well was lying to you. Coulter Vance's face went through something she had never seen on a man of his particular construction. Not anger, not yet. Though anger was coming, she could see it assembling itself beneath the surface like weather. What crossed his face first was something older and more devastating than anger. It was the specific expression of a man who has been betrayed by something he trusted completely, and who is only now understanding the full geometry of what that betrayal cost. "Galveston," he said. Barely a sound. "Your attorney," Briggs said from the wall. His voice had changed. The confrontational edge was still there, but it was now pointed somewhere else entirely, and behind it was something that sounded surprisingly like devastation. "The man we trusted with the Rowan Fund for 3 years. I want to know everything he has," Vance said. He wasn't speaking to anyone specific. He was speaking to the room, and the room understood him. Every account, every transfer record, every communication that went out under his name on our behalf. "Coulter." Briggs said it differently now. "If Galveston's been skimming the Rowan Fund, if he's connected to Marsh, if the land grab and the rerouted convoy and Danny going down tonight are all the same, then we have a bigger problem than a sabotage generator." Vance picked up his phone. Still no signal. He looked at it for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who has reached the edge of what patience can accomplish and is recalculating what comes next. "We need comms, real comms, not cell." "I have a radio," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. "CB, in the kitchen. My parents put it in when this stretch of road was even more isolated than it is now." She paused. "It's old, but it works." Vance nodded once. "Show me." She moved toward the kitchen, and he fell in beside her, and as they passed the corner booth, Maisie looked up from her notebook with the purple crayon and her father's patch and her 6-year-old's entirely accurate assessment of everything happening around her. "Mama," she said, "the man with the silver boots. He was taking pictures of the outside of the diner when you weren't looking. I saw him from the window. He took pictures of the sign and the back where the generator is and the junction box." She looked at Vance. "I didn't tell Mama because she was already sad enough that week." The kitchen door swung behind them. In the silence that followed, Briggs straightened from the wall for the first time since the lights went out. He crossed the diner in 7 steps to the booth where Maisie was sitting, and he crouched down the way the big bearded man had crouched down, so that his eyes were level with hers, and he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear it. Nobody else in the room tried to listen. They gave the space to him and to her the way men give space to the specific gravity of a child in a room where something serious is happening. Whatever Briggs said, Maisie considered it for a moment with the seriousness she brought to all things that deserved seriousness. Then she nodded. Then she turned her notebook to a fresh page and began drawing, and what she drew, slowly, from memory, in purple crayon, was a pair of boots with a silver piece on the side, at the junction box, at the back of the copper kettle, in the snow. The CB radio in the kitchen crackled to life with a sound like someone clearing their throat. Static, then signal, then Vance's voice, making contact with something outside the blizzard. Another voice, distant and flat, and carrying information that made the muscle in his jaw jump once before he controlled it. Clara stood beside him in the kitchen and listened and understood about half of what was exchanged in the shorthand of men who have communicated in crisis for long enough that full sentences are a luxury neither party bothers with. She understood enough. She understood that the route change hadn't only rerouted the convoy. She understood that the original Highway 2 route the Ashvow had been traveling would have taken them through a way station checkpoint staffed tonight by state officers carrying warrants. Warrants for Coulter Vance, on charges that had been filed 3 days ago by an attorney named Galveston on behalf of an unnamed client, for misappropriation of funds. The irony of it was so complete and so vicious that for a moment she couldn't speak. Someone had stolen the money meant for her and Jesse's daughter, and then used the theft to file criminal charges against the man who'd set the money aside to begin with, and had rerouted the convoy carrying that man away from the trap, but only in order to spring a different trap, here, on this road, at this diner, in this storm. They hadn't been herded away from the warrant. They'd been herded here, to her. Coulter, she said. He was already looking at her. He'd been watching her process it. Why here? She said. Of all the places on this highway, why my diner? And Coulter Vance, who had been carrying something all evening that she'd seen without being able to name, finally let her see what it was. Because Marsh knows what Jesse meant to us, he said. And because he's been waiting 3 years for the moment when Jesse's family was desperate enough, and we were implicated enough, and the situation was tangled enough that nobody would look twice at what happened next. He looked at the CB, then at the window above the sink, where the blizzard was making its patient case against the glass. He needs this property. He needs us discredited and looking guilty. And he needed tonight to be the night it all happened at once. He paused. We gave him the convoy on the road. You gave him the diner. He looked at her. Someone gave him the storm. People can't arrange blizzards. No, but they can arrange to wait for one. In the diner, through the kitchen door, she could hear the riders moving, not randomly, but purposefully, the particular sound of men who have received unspoken information and are repositioning in response to it. She heard Briggs's voice giving quiet instructions. She heard the boots on the linoleum, heavy and deliberate. She heard Maisie's crayon against the paper. There's something else, Vance said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when a thing was serious enough to require economy. No extra words, no preamble, just the weight of the thing itself. The accident, Jesse's accident, 3 years ago. Her hand found the edge of the counter. The file that Galveston submitted with the warrants, Vance said. My contact just read me the summary. It references the accident as... He stopped, started again. As a pre-existing complication, a contingency that was managed. She stared at him. Clara. He said her name for the first time, and it landed differently than she expected. Not hard, not soft, but with a precision that suggested he understood exactly how much weight it was carrying. I think Jesse's accident may have been the beginning of this, not the end. The CB radio let out a burst of static. Then a new voice came through. Not the distant contact from before, but something closer. Something that shouldn't have been on that frequency. Something that spoke 3 words in a flat and unhurried tone before the signal cut. We see you. Clara Rowan stood in her mother's kitchen in her dead parents' diner with her daughter on the other side of the door, and 50 men whose names she hadn't known 4 hours ago between her and a blizzard that was covering every road out of Widow Creek. And she understood with the bone-level certainty that she'd always trusted above everything else that the worst night of her life wasn't 3 years ago on this highway. It was tonight, and it was only just beginning. We see you. 3 words. Flat, unhurried. The kind of voice that doesn't need to threaten, because the threat is already ambient, built into the frequency, into the timing, into the simple fact that someone had found their channel and chosen those 3 words and nothing else. Vance killed the CB. The kitchen went silent, except for the storm and Clara's breathing, and the distant sound of the diner reorganizing itself on the other side of the door. "They've had us since before we arrived," Vance said. Not to her specifically, to the space in front of him, the way a man talks when he's thinking out loud and doesn't care who hears. "They had the channel, they had the junction box, they had the warrant ready." He turned. "This wasn't improvised, this was constructed." "Over how long?" Clara asked. "Long enough to know our route protocols, long enough to file the warrant with documentation that looked legitimate." He picked up the CB handset again and then set it down without keying it. "Long enough to know Jesse." She said it before she could stop herself. "What do you know about how Jesse died?" He looked at her with the specific attention of a man who has something to say and is calculating what it costs to say it here, in this kitchen, at this hour, to this woman. "The accident report said black ice," he said. "Single vehicle, no witnesses. The truck went through the guardrail on the curve above Sawmill Creek and went down the embankment. I know what it said. The guardrail on that curve was replaced 6 weeks before the accident. New hardware, new posts, new tensioning cable." He paused. "A county contract, awarded through a subsidiary of Marsh Development Group." Clara put her hand on the counter again, kneaded the solid thing. "That's public record," Vance said. "It's something anyone could pull. The problem is that nobody pulled it, because nobody was looking, because the accident was ruled an accident in 48 hours, and the file was closed." He looked at her. "I started looking 8 months ago, when the Rowan Fund payments stopped reconciling in our own accounts, and I asked Galveston for an audit, and he kept finding reasons to delay." 8 months, she said. "I know. You've known for 8 months that something was wrong with the fund, and you didn't—" She stopped herself. Rebuilt the sentence from a different angle, the way she rebuilt things when the first version came out too hot to be useful. "You didn't contact me. Galveston told me he was in contact with you, that you'd asked for privacy, that you were managing well." He said it without defense, which was the only reason she didn't say what she was thinking. I believed him. That was my failure, and I own it. "Yes," she said. "You do." He accepted that without flinching. Another point in whatever column she was building for him without fully meaning to. She pushed off the counter and went to the kitchen door and looked through the small porthole window into the diner. Maisie was still in the booth. Preach was still by Danny's table. The writers had shifted, subtly but completely, from the loose dispersal of exhausted men warming up to something that looked more like a perimeter. Backs to the walls, eyes on the windows. The body language of people who had received information and were acting on it without making it obvious that they were acting on it. "Your men know," she said. "Word moves fast in a small room." "Are they going to do something stupid?" "Define stupid." She turned from the porthole, right out into that storm looking for whoever was on the radio. "No." He said it without hesitation. That's what those 3 words were designed to produce. Somebody goes out, they get separated, the storm does the rest. He crossed to the door and pushed it open and moved back into the diner, and she followed because the kitchen felt suddenly like a place she didn't want to be alone in. Briggs met them at the counter. He had Maisie's drawing in his hand, the purple crayon rendering of the boots at the junction box, and the expression of a man who has been putting things together in the dark and hasn't liked what they've assembled into. "The boots," he said. He set the drawing on the counter and put his phone beside it. On the phone screen was a photograph, a social media image, cached before the service died, showing a group of men at what appeared to be a county zoning meeting. In the front row, a man in a dark jacket with silver-buckled boots. The same configuration, the same placement of the hardware on the outer ankle. "His name is Teller Marsh," Briggs said. "Aldrich Marsh's son. Handles the operational side of the development company. Permits, site surveys, contract management." He paused. "He was at the way station checkpoint tonight, the one on Highway 2, the one the convoy was supposed to go through." The geometry of it completed itself in the room. "He couldn't be in 2 places," Clara said. "No," Briggs said. "He couldn't. So the question is whether he was at the checkpoint waiting for us, or whether he was here cutting the power, and the answer is..." He turned the phone screen toward Vance. "The checkpoint has security cameras. My contact in Billings pulled the footage 20 minutes ago while we still had signal. Teller Marsh checked into the checkpoint at 6 p.m. and was logged leaving at 9:47. We arrived here at 9:53, Vance said. So he wasn't the one at the junction box, Clara said. No. Briggs picked up the drawing and looked at it again. Someone else cut your power. Someone we haven't seen yet. He folded the drawing once, carefully, as if it were evidence, which it was. Someone who knew the diner layout well enough to find the box in a blizzard in the dark. Clara thought about the man Maisie had described, the unhurried quality of his movement in the camera footage, the 40 seconds at the box, not searching, knowing. Someone who'd surveyed the property, she said. Yeah. Marsh filed that injunction 6 weeks ago. His attorney would have needed to document the property to support the title defect claim. She went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. They were here, legally, with cameras and clipboards, and I let them walk the perimeter because I thought it was due diligence for the filing. Briggs and Vance exchanged one look, the kind of look between men who've known each other long enough that the look is a complete sentence. I need to make a call, Vance said. Real comms, not the CB. There's a landline, Clara said, in the back office. It runs on the phone company's own infrastructure, not the building's electrical. She'd kept it for exactly this reason. Her father had told her always to have something that worked when everything else failed. Old copper line. Should still have a dial tone. She led him through the kitchen and into the narrow room behind it that she'd always called the office, but was really just a closet with a desk and a filing cabinet, and the telephone her parents had installed in 1987 and never saw a reason to replace. The handset was heavy and black and real. And when she lifted it, the dial tone came through clear and immediate. She handed it to him and stepped back to give him space, and then she looked at the filing cabinet while he dialed, because looking at the filing cabinet was something to look at that wasn't him, and she needed a moment that wasn't being watched. The filing cabinet was her father's. 3 drawers, olive green, 1 handle missing. She kept the business records in it, invoices, repair receipts, the lease agreements her parents had signed when they expanded the parking lot, the property survey from when she'd tried to refinance 2 years ago and failed. The property survey. She opened the bottom drawer. Vance was talking behind her, low, fast, the compressed language of someone conveying maximum information in minimum time to someone who knew how to receive it that way. She wasn't listening to the words. She was listening to the drawer sliding open and the weight of the hanging files and her own breathing. The survey was there. She'd filed it under P for property, the way her mother had taught her to file things, alphabetically and always, because chaos started in the filing cabinet and spread outward. She pulled the folder and opened it on the desk beside the phone. The property survey was dated 2 years ago. Standard documentation, boundary lines, measurements, the legal description of the lot. She'd read it twice when the refinancing application was active and hadn't thought about it since. She read it now. She read it 3 times because the first time she thought she was misunderstanding, and the second time she thought she was misreading, and by the third time she understood that she was neither. The survey noted in a single footnote at the bottom of page 4 that the eastern boundary of the Copper Kettle property overlapped by 11 feet with a documented right-of-way corridor registered to the Montana Department of Transportation in 1987. A corridor that, the footnote observed, had been proposed for potential expansion in a state highway infrastructure plan. A plan dated 1987. Updated, according to the footnote, in a county infrastructure review 18 months ago. A review administered through the County Planning Commission, whose chairman, she now remembered with the specific clarity of information that becomes important after the fact, was a man named Harold Cates, who had been a guest at Aldrich Marsh's holiday party 3 Decembers ago, which she knew because the Widow Creek Gazette had run a photo and she'd seen it at the laundromat and then forgotten it the way you forget things that don't yet have context. Coulter. Her voice came out differently than she intended. Not steady, not the ER voice, something rawer than that. He was still on the phone. He looked at her. She held up the survey. He said into the phone, "I'll call you back." Set it down. She pointed to the footnote. He read it. He read it the way she'd read it. Once too fast, once slowing down, the third time with his jaw set and his breathing changed and his left hand flat on the desk in a position that suggested he needed the solid thing the same way she had in the kitchen. "The right-of-way," he said. "If the MTD expands that corridor, my 11-foot encroachment becomes a legal problem for the whole property boundary. The eastern wall of the diner sits inside it." She could hear the dryness in her own voice, The clinical distance that showed up when she was processing something her emotional system wasn't ready to handle, which would give a buyer grounds to claim the existing structure has an unresolvable title issue, which would collapse the market value, which would make a foreclosure sale. Cheap. Very cheap. She closed the folder. The title defect Galveston. Marsh's attorney, Galveston. I assume they're connected. They went to law school together, Vance said. I found that 2 months ago. I couldn't make it mean anything then. It means Galveston identified this survey footnote and built a legal strategy around it. The injunction isn't designed to win in court. It's designed to make the diner legally untouchable for any other buyer while the costs of fighting it push me into default. She put the survey back in the folder and the folder back in the drawer and closed the drawer with a click that sounded, in the narrow room, very final. And the warrant for you. The misappropriation charges. If I'm under investigation, the club's assets freeze, Vance said, including the fund accounts, including anything we might move to help with, legal fees. She looked at him. You can't fund my fight without implicating yourself further. That's the design. He said it quietly, and in the quiet of it was the specific exhaustion of a man who has realized he's been inside a trap long enough that the trap has become the shape of his life. They didn't need us to lose. They just needed us to be unable to help without making everything worse. She thought about Jesse, about the guardrail contract, about a county planning commission updating a 1987 right-of-way document 18 months ago, right around the time that the Rowan Fund stopped reconciling, right around the time that Marsh began buying up Highway 12 properties. She thought about the timing of it all, with the terrible patience of someone who has been operating alone for 3 years and has learned to think in long chains of cause and effect because there is no one else to share the load. Jesse found something, she said. Vance went still. Before the accident, he was a contractor, civil engineering. He worked highway infrastructure projects for the state. She was saying it as she was understanding it, the words barely ahead of the realization. He would have known about right-of-way corridors. He would have had access to planning documents. She looked at the filing cabinet. He kept files. He kept everything. It was the thing about him that drove me insane when we were married. He never threw anything away because he said you never know when something becomes evidence. She opened the middle drawer of the filing cabinet, her father's business records, her mother's personal correspondence, and behind it, in a hanging file she had not opened since the week after Jesse's funeral because she hadn't been able to, a section she'd labeled simply Jesse in black marker on the tab. I put his work files in here when I cleared the house, she said. I just couldn't go through them, so I filed them. She pulled the hanging file. It was heavy, heavier than she remembered. The kind of heavy that said whoever had assembled it had spent time on it, had organized, categorized, cross-referenced with the care of a methodical man who believed in documentation. She set it on the desk. Vance didn't move toward it. He waited. He understood without being told that this was hers to open. She opened it. The first thing in the file was a standard project folder. Highway inspection reports, routine infrastructure documentation, nothing unusual. The second folder was the same. The third folder was thinner than the others, and instead of a printed label, it had a handwritten one in Jesse's handwriting. 3 letters in blue pen, MTD, MRD, Montana Department of Transportation. And something else, MRD. She didn't know what MRD was. She pulled the folder. Inside were printed emails, 12 of them, dated over a period of 8 months ending 6 weeks before Jesse's accident. The emails were between Jesse and a man identified only as K. Soren, with a state government email address that Clara didn't recognize. The language was technical in places and plain in others, and what it described, across those 12 exchanges, was a pattern of falsified inspection reports on Highway 12 guardrail installations. Specifically, the installation at Sawmill Creek Curve, specifically the tensioning hardware, specifically the load specifications that had been signed off by a county contractor and countersigned by a state inspector whose name appeared at the bottom of every falsified report. The inspector's name was Harold Cates. Before he was chairman of the County Planning Commission, Harold Cates had been a state highway inspector for 11 years. The last email in the file was from Jesse to K. Soren, dated 6 weeks before the accident. It read, I'm taking this to the state AG's office next week. I've documented everything. I need you to confirm you're willing to testify. If Kate's and the contractor are both connected to Marsh's right-of-way applications, this is bigger than the guardrail. This is a systematic conspiracy to compromise public infrastructure and corridors Marsh intends to acquire. People could die. People may already have. I need to know you're with me on this. There was no reply from Kay Soren in the file. There was nothing else in the file. Clara Rowan stood in her parents' office in her dead parents' diner holding the document that explained the death of her husband. And the room was very small, and the storm outside was very large. And Coulter Vance was very still beside her, and for approximately 15 seconds she felt nothing at all. Not grief, not rage, not the wild, spinning disorientation of having the last 3 years of her life restructured by a folder in a filing cabinet. Just a clean, suspended, breathless nothing. Then she felt everything. She set the folder on the desk. She put her hands on the desk beside it and looked at the wall and breathed. Once, twice, a third time, with the deliberateness of someone managing a physical response that cannot be allowed to become visible yet, because there is too much still to do. He knew, she said. Not to Vance, not to anyone. He was going to the Attorney General, and they knew he was going, and she stopped. 6 weeks. He had 6 weeks left, and they... Clara. Don't. Her voice came out sharp enough to cut, and she heard it hit him, and she didn't apologize because she didn't have it to spare right now. Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. It was the most valuable thing anyone had given her in 3 years, that minute. Not comfort, not explanation, just space to stand in the fact of it. She used it. She stood in the fact of it, and it was enormous, and she let it be enormous. And then she picked up Jessie's folder and turned around. I need to get Maisie, she said. She's safe. I need to have eyes on my daughter, right now. She moved past him into the kitchen. You can come or not. She went through the kitchen and into the diner, and Maisie was in the booth with the purple crayon going on a new drawing, and Preach was by Danny's table, and all the writers were where they'd been, and the relief she felt at seeing Maisie's bent head, and the crayon moving was so violent and so total that she had to stop in the kitchen doorway for a half-second to absorb it before she could move again. She went to the booth and sat down across from her daughter. Maisie looked up, read her mother's face the way she always read it, with the exhaustive accuracy of a child who has spent 3 years learning her mother's expressions as a survival language. Something bad, Maisie said. Not a question. Something hard, Clara said. Not bad for us. Just hard to know. Maisie put down the crayon. She reached across the table and put her hand on top of her mother's hand, and her hand was tiny and warm and real, and Clara turned her palm up and held it and looked at the leather patch around her daughter's neck, and thought about Jessie going back into a burning wreck twice for strangers, and then 6 months later sitting at their kitchen table documenting a conspiracy because people could die and he couldn't let that happen. She thought about the guardrail he'd documented failing. She thought about him dying on that curve. Mama, Maisie said, the man outside is back. Clara's head came up. What man? The man who's been walking around the building. I've seen him go past the window 3 times. She pointed at the window beside the booth, the one that faced the east side of the building, the one that faced the junction box. He has a flashlight, but he keeps it pointed down. Clara was at the window before the sentence finished. She couldn't see anything in the blizzard. The snow was too dense and the dark too complete, and her own reflection was in the way. She pressed her forehead to the glass and cupped her hands against it and waited for her eyes to adjust. There. East side. A light pointed down, moving. She turned to find Vance directly behind her. East wall, she said. Someone on foot. He already had 2 fingers raised toward the 2 men nearest the east windows. They moved without a sound. Not toward the door, but into positions where they could see both the window and the approach corridor from the back. Blocking lines of sight, covering angles. The efficiency of it was complete and wordless, and she didn't have time to think about what it meant that she found it reassuring. Briggs appeared from her left. I see him. He's not approaching. He's surveilling. Has been for about 20 minutes by my read. Why didn't you? Because he's staying outside. The moment he moves toward a door, that changes. Briggs's eyes were on the window. Right now he's gathering information, which means he reports to someone, which means we have time. Time for what? Clara asked. To decide what we want him to report. She looked at Briggs. At the particular cold clarity in his face. Not violent, but tactical in a way that suggested violence was one of several available tools, and he was currently assessing which one fit the job. "You want him to go back and tell Marsh that we're stranded and fractured and don't know what's coming," she said. "I want him to go back and tell Marsh exactly what Marsh wants to hear." Briggs glanced at Vance. "Which means we need to look like what Marsh thinks we are. Trapped, disorganized, running out of options." "We are running out of options," Clara said. "Not as many as we were 20 minutes ago." Briggs nodded at the folder in her hands. "What's that?" She looked at the folder, at Jesse's handwriting on the tab, at the 12 emails inside it, and the name Harold Cates at the bottom of every falsified inspection report. She thought about Kay Soren, whoever Kay Soren was, and the unanswered email asking if he was willing to testify. She thought about an attorney general's office that Jesse had never reached. "Evidence," she said. "Enough of it that if it reaches the right people, then Marsh doesn't just lose the property dispute," Vance said from behind her. "He loses everything. Cates goes down with him. Galveston goes down. The warranty fraud on the infrastructure contracts becomes a state criminal matter." "And your charges disappear," she said. "And Danny Reyes didn't almost die in a ditch for nothing," Vance said. It came out quieter than everything else he'd said tonight, and it carried more weight than all of it. Outside, the shadow with the flashlight completed another circuit of the building and stopped at the east wall. "The landline," Vance said. "Does it reach Billings?" "It reaches anywhere a phone reaches. I need 20 minutes and an attorney who is not Galveston." "I have my attorney on speed dial. She's not Galveston. She's 72 years old and she has never lost a case she believed in. And she picks up her phone at 2 in the morning because she says sleep is for people without enough problems." Clara was already moving toward the office. She is going to have thoughts about this folder. She was in the kitchen when the front door opened. Not a push from outside. The specific controlled opening of someone using a key. Not a key. A pick. The quiet mechanical click of a lock being worked by someone who knew how to work it, followed by the brief violent intrusion of blizzard air, and then the door swinging shut again. And then a man was standing inside the copper kettle who had not been inside it before. He was wet with snow and carrying nothing visible in his hands, which Clara registered as she came back through the kitchen door at the wrong moment. The moment when she was between the office and the diner, and the angle gave her a clear view of the front of the room and also meant she was visible from the front of the room. He saw her. He was somewhere in his 50s, with the compact build of a man who had kept himself functional rather than impressive. And he wore a dark jacket with no insignia, and he had the face of someone who had spent years delivering information that other people didn't want to receive. He looked at Clara, then at the writers around the room who had already begun to orient toward him with the specific attention of men who have spent the last hour calibrating their threat assessment. Then back at Clara. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. His voice was flat and precise and aimed only at her, as if the 40-plus bikers repositioning around the room were ambient features rather than immediate concerns. "My name is Kevin Soren. I'm a former Montana State Highway Inspector." He reached into his jacket with one hand slowly and produced a folded document. "And I've been trying to reach you for 3 years." The name hit Clara like cold water. Not shocking, but clarifying, stripping away everything that wasn't essential. Kay Soren. The unanswered email. The man Jesse had asked if he was willing to testify, and who had not replied. "You didn't answer him," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. Soren's face did something controlled and painful. "I know. He's dead." "I know that too." He held out the document. "That's why I'm here." She didn't move toward it. "Why now? 3 years later in a blizzard through a picked lock. Why now?" "Because Marsh moved the timeline up tonight, and if I don't give you what I have before morning, it disappears. All of it." He glanced at Vance, who had not moved from his position, but whose position had changed in quality, from watchful to something more absolute. Then back to Clara. "Jesse sent me a copy of everything he had. I sat on it because I was afraid. I've been afraid for 3 years. I have a daughter too, Mrs. Rowan." His jaw tightened. "That stopped being an acceptable reason tonight when I found out what Marsh is planning for this building before sunrise." The room contracted. "What is he planning?" Vance said. Not loud, not threatening, just the sentence, dropped into the room with the weight of the thing it was asking. Soren looked at him, made a decision, looked back at Clara. "He's not coming for the property through the courts anymore," Soren said. He filed the injunction as a delay, not a solution. His actual plan, the one I've had partial documentation on for 8 months, is to condemn the building on structural grounds. He paused. There's a county structural assessor who works for Marsh. He was supposed to appear tomorrow morning with a condemnation order citing the Eastern Foundation. Emergency condemnation, the kind that doesn't require court approval, just a county assessor's signature and a building inspector's countersignature. He looked at the folder in Clara's hands. But tonight, with you, with them, he indicated the room. Marsh decided not to wait for morning. He's coming tonight, Clara said. He's already on the highway. His people tracked the convoy here. They know what you have. They know about Jesse's files. They've known those files existed for 3 years because Jesse told me he was going to the AG, and I told... He stopped. His jaw worked. I told someone I trusted. Who told Marsh? That's why Jesse died 6 weeks later, and why I've been living inside that fact ever since. He held out the document again. This is everything I have. Every falsified inspection. Every back-channel communication between Cates, Galveston, and Marsh's contracting company. Signed statements from 2 other inspectors who worked under Cates and are willing to go on record. He paused. It's enough. It was always enough. Jesse was right, and I was a coward. And people died. And now here we are. Clara took the document. She took it the way she'd taken emergency cases in the ER. 2 hands, deliberate grip, immediate ownership of the responsibility it represented. She didn't open it. There wasn't time to open it. She looked at Vance. He looked at her. Outside, the blizzard pressed itself against every wall of the copper kettle with patient, enormous force, and somewhere on the highway, a man with enough money and enough corruption and enough years of protected wrongdoing was driving toward her diner in the dark, and the landline was in the office, and Jesse's folder was in her hand, and Maisie was in the booth with her purple crayon and her father's patch and her terrifying 6-year-old fearlessness. And Clara Rowan felt something change inside her. Not break, not crack, not the controlled fracture of grief being reopened, but something more fundamental and less reversible than any of those things. She felt herself stop waiting. She had been waiting for 3 years without knowing she was waiting. Waiting for the grief to resolve, for the money to stabilize, for some external circumstance to shift the pressure enough that survival stopped being the only available mode. She had been managing, enduring, persisting with the quiet stubbornness of someone who doesn't quit because quitting isn't available, but she had not been moving, not forward, not in the direction of the thing that killed Jesse and the thing that was trying to finish what it started by taking the last thing he'd left her. She looked at the landline. She looked at Vance. She looked at Soren with his document and his 3 years of carried guilt and his daughter, who was the reason he'd been afraid, and also, tonight, the reason he'd finally stopped being afraid. I need the phone, she said. I need my attorney, and I need every piece of documentation in that folder and this one scanned or photographed before Marsh gets within 10 miles of this building. We have phones, Vance said. No signal, but cameras work. Then start photographing, every page, both folders. She was already moving toward the office. And someone needs to tell me right now. If Marsh arrives here tonight with a county assessor and a condemnation order, what does that look like legally? Does he have the right to enter the building? Emergency condemnation orders have immediate effect, Soren said. If the assessor signs off, you have 24 hours to vacate. And if I don't vacate, then the county can remove you. With law enforcement? With whoever they send. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, turned. Coulter. She said his name the way she'd said it in the kitchen, with the weight of what it was carrying, not more than that. If Marsh gets here before I reach the Attorney General's office, if he comes with the condemnation order and county authority, and there's nothing I can do legally to stop him tonight. She looked at him, and at Briggs, and at the room full of men who had been in her diner for 2 hours, and had eaten her food and accepted her daughter's blankets, and were now positioned at every door and window with the silent vigilance of people who had decided something without being asked. What do you do? Coulter Vance looked at her for a long moment. We stand, he said. It was 2 words, and they were the simplest 2 words she'd heard all night. And they were also, she understood in that moment, the most absolute, because they came from the same place Jesse had come from when he went back into a burning truck for strangers, and when he sat at their kitchen table documenting falsified inspection reports, because people could die, and he couldn't let that happen, and she understood for the first time that the thing she'd always called Jesse's stubbornness, and his impossibility, and his refusal to let things go was not stubbornness at all, but was the same thing she was feeling right now, standing in her dead parents' diner with her daughter in the next room and a folder full of evidence and a landline phone that could reach an attorney general's office. It was the refusal to be the person who didn't act when acting was possible. She went to the phone. She picked up the handset and dialed her attorney's number from memory. And while it rang, she could hear the sound beginning, low and distant and growing, coming from the direction of the highway, the specific pitch of vehicles moving through snow at a speed that meant they weren't being careful about the conditions. That meant the people inside them had decided that urgency outweighed caution. The phone rang twice. Then Margaret Oakes, 72 years old, picked up on the second ring, and Clara Rowan said, "Margaret, I need you to listen to everything I say next without stopping me, because I have maybe 15 minutes, and when I'm done talking, I need you to know exactly who to call." And outside, on Highway 12, the headlights were coming. Margaret Oakes said, "Don't hang up." Then she put Clara on hold, and Clara stood in the office with the handset pressed to her ear and Jesse's folder and Soren's document on the desk in front of her, and listened to the silence on the line that meant a 72-year-old attorney was making calls that mattered, and outside the headlights on Highway 12 were closer now, close enough that she could see them through the small office window. 3 sets? Maybe 4. Moving in convoy through the blizzard at the speed of people who had decided the road conditions were someone else's problem. She watched them and waited and breathed. The hold ended. "Clara!" Margaret's voice had changed, not alarmed, but activated, the shift from sleeping to operational that Clara had always found extraordinary in her. "I've reached the duty officer at the AG's office. He's been briefed. He needs the documentation digitally within the hour. Photograph everything and send it to this address." She read an email address slowly, and Clara wrote it on the back of an envelope from the desk drawer. "He's also contacting the State Highway Patrol Commander directly, not the county." Not the county, do you understand me? Because if Cates has relationships in county law enforcement, we cannot trust the local chain. "I understand. How long until Marsh arrives?" Clara looked out the window. 10 minutes, maybe less. "Then start photographing, right now, while we talk." A pause. "And Clara, the condemnation order. If it's issued under Cates's authority as Planning Commission Chairman, it's already compromised evidence. Any action taken under it tonight becomes part of the criminal case. Do not leave the building voluntarily. Do not sign anything. Do not let anyone in without identifying themselves by full name and badge number. And if you have any way to record what happens, record it." "I have 50 bikers with phones." A beat of silence. "Well," Margaret said, "that works?" Clara hung up and went into the diner. "I need every phone in this room that has a camera and a charge," she said, "and I need somebody to start photographing every page of these 2 folders right now." 3 phones appeared on the counter before she'd finished the sentence. Briggs took the folders without being asked and began working through them with the systematic speed of someone who'd processed documents under pressure before, laying each page flat on the counter, shooting it clean, moving to the next. The phones passed between riders, charging duty divided without discussion. The efficiency of a group that had long since dissolved the boundary between individual action and collective function. Vance appeared from the front of the diner. "They're pulling off the highway." "How many vehicles?" 4, 2 trucks, 2 SUVs. He paused. "One of the SUVs has county markings." "The assessor," Soren said. He had not moved from the center of the diner, had stood there since delivering his document with the particular stillness of a man who has done the thing he came to do and is now waiting to see what it costs. "He wouldn't come without the assessor. The condemnation order isn't valid without the counter signature." "Can we stop the assessor from signing?" Clara asked. "If the AG's duty officer contacts him directly, yes. If that call hasn't gone through yet..." Soren shook his head. "Cates has been managing this man for 2 years. One phone call from the AG's office breaks that, but it has to get there first." Clara looked at Vance. "How long do we need?" "Long enough for the documentation to go through and the AG's office to make contact." He looked at Briggs, who was still moving through the pages with steady mechanical focus. "How many pages left?" 40? Maybe 45? "At this speed?" 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Clara set it in her head and felt the weight of it. 8 minutes against 4 vehicles in the parking lot, and an emergency condemnation order, and a man who had been building this particular evening for 3 years. "Stall them," she said. Vance looked at her. "Go out there and stall them. You're a biker president who just got his convoy off a dangerous road. You're cold and your rider is down and you're not going anywhere in this storm. Give Marsh an audience. Let him think he's in control." She held his gaze. "You know how to do that. You want me to perform weakness. I want you to perform exactly as much weakness as it takes to buy 8 minutes." Something shifted in his expression. Not admiration exactly, but the recognition of a particular kind of thinking that he understood and respected. He looked at Briggs once. Briggs nodded without looking up from the documents. Vance buttoned his cut, ran his hand once over his face in a gesture that erased something from his expression and left behind a version of himself that looked more tired, more beaten down, more defeated than anything Clara had seen on him all evening. The transformation took 4 seconds and was complete. Then he walked to the front door and went out into the storm. Clara went to the window. The 4 vehicles had parked in a loose arc across the diner's lot, their headlights aimed at the building in a configuration that was technically just parking but carried the unmistakable message of a deliberate barrier. Doors opened. Men got out. 6, 8, more, spreading across the lot with the practiced spread of people doing a job they've rehearsed. 2 of them had the bulk and deliberate carriage of hired security. One wore a county vest over his jacket, the assessor, clipboard already in hand despite the blizzard, the posture of someone who has been told this is administrative and has chosen to believe that. The last man out of the lead SUV was Aldrich Marsh. Clara had seen him once in person, the meeting 6 weeks ago when he'd brought his drawn-up paperwork, and his calm certainty that she would take his offer. He was in his 60s, built with the compactness of a man who had been athletic in youth and had preserved the structure if not the specifics, with white hair and a face that had learned to present itself as reasonable regardless of what was behind it. He wore a heavy wool coat and carried nothing in his hands, which was its own kind of statement, the statement of a man who employs people to carry things. He looked at the diner. He looked at the 50-plus motorcycles in his way. He looked at Vance, who had appeared at the edge of the light with his hands in his jacket pockets and his shoulders carrying the deliberate weight of a man who is very tired and just wants to get his people through the night. Clara couldn't hear them. She pressed closer to the glass and watched the body language. Marsh measured, controlled, presenting the condemnation paperwork with the casual authority of someone who has done this before. Vance looking at it, taking his time, handing it back slowly, saying something. Marsh responding. The assessor hovering at the edge of the conversation with his clipboard and his county vest, and the increasingly uncomfortable posture of a man who has been told this would be simple. 4 minutes, Briggs said from the counter. Clara didn't turn from the window. Outside, one of the security men had begun moving toward the diner door. Not aggressively, but with the purposeful drift of someone carrying out a secondary instruction. Vance shifted his weight 1 inch, and the man stopped. Not because of what Vance did. The shift was too small to read as a command from this distance. But 2 riders had materialized from the shadows beside the diner's east wall, and 2 more had appeared near the parking lot entrance, and the security man's peripheral vision had done the arithmetic and arrived at the answer that stopping was the correct choice. Marsh noticed. Clara watched him notice. The small recalibration in his posture, the reassessment behind the reasonable face. He said something to Vance. Vance said something back. The exchange was brief and from this angle unreadable, and then Marsh looked at the diner and directly at the window where Clara was standing, and she stepped back from the glass by instinct, even though she knew the light behind her made her already visible. He knew she was watching. He'd known she was there. He turned back to Vance with the small, precise smile of a man who is content to let the scene run its current course, because he believes the outcome is already established. 2 minutes, Briggs said. One of the security men had moved to the lead SUV and was on a phone call. Clara watched him. The body language of someone receiving instruction rather than giving it. The slight change in how he held himself as the call went on. Something that looked like adjustment, recalibration. "Is the email going through?" she asked. "Sending now." A writer she didn't know by name was at the back booth with a phone and the envelope with the email address Clara had written. "Attachment is large. The signal out here is..." A pause. "Sending." The front door opened. Not Vance. Marsh came through first with the assessor immediately behind him and 2 security men flanking both, and the cold that came in with them was different from the blizzard cold, purposeful, contained, the specific temperature of a confrontation that has been a long time arriving. Marsh stopped 3 feet inside the door. He looked at the room, the riders, the arrangement of bodies, the long table where Danny Reyes was lying with color in his face now and his eyes open, tracking the new arrivals with a focus that suggested he'd been awake for longer than anyone had announced. He looked at Briggs at the counter with the folder contents spread before him. He looked at Soren, and something happened in Marsh's expression when he saw Soren, something fast and involuntary that he covered immediately, but not before it registered. He recovered in under a second. Looked at Clara. Mrs. Rowan. His voice was the same voice she remembered, reasonable, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades presenting himself as the person in any room who most wanted a fair outcome. I apologize for the hour. I know this is difficult, but I have a county-issued emergency structural assessment order for this property, and I need you to understand that this isn't personal. It's extremely personal, Clara said. He paused, adjusted. I understand you feel that way. The Eastern Foundation issue you're citing. She kept her voice even and her hands at her sides. When was that assessment conducted? The county assessor can speak to the timeline. I'm asking you. Marsh looked at the assessor. The assessor looked at his clipboard. The preliminary assessment was conducted 6 weeks ago, the assessor said. He was younger than she'd expected, with the look of someone who had taken a county job expecting routine work, and was only now understanding the nature of the particular routine he'd been incorporated into. Based on a report filed by Harold Cates, Clara said. The assessor stopped. Who was, before his current role as County Planning Commission chairman, a state highway inspector for 11 years, during which time he falsified structural safety reports on guardrail installations along Highway 12 in exchange for contracts awarded through Marsh Development Group subsidiaries. She watched Marsh's face while she said it, watched the reasonable expression hold. He was good, she gave him that. He was very good. While behind his eyes something shifted from management to calculation, including the installation at Sawmill Creek Curve, the installation that failed 3 years ago, the installation that killed my husband. The room was absolutely still. The assessor had stopped writing on his clipboard. Mrs. Rowan, Marsh said, I understand grief can cause... Don't. Her voice had the edge in it that she'd spent 11 years developing in emergency rooms where people tried to manage her with tone. Don't finish that sentence. You drove here tonight because you knew what was in Jesse's files and you needed to take this building before the documentation reached the state attorney general's office. She looked at him. It's already there. The first crack appeared. Not in his expression, in the calculation behind it. The specific shift of a man whose timeline has been disrupted and is running scenarios. You're bluffing, he said. The duty officer's name is Garrett Finch, she said. He took my call at 2:17 this morning. He's currently contacting State Highway Patrol Commander Delia Rosser to request a response unit, not county law enforcement, not county, because the county chain is compromised and we both know why. She paused. You're welcome to call him and confirm. Marsh looked at his phone, then at his security men, then at the room full of riders who had not moved and were not moving and were generating collectively the specific energy of things that will not be moved regardless of what is asked of them. He looked at Soren. Kevin, he said, almost gentle. Whatever you think you have. Everything, Soren said. It was the first word he'd spoken since Marsh entered, and it landed in the room with the weight of 3 years of carried guilt finally set down. Signed statements, archived communications, the original inspection discrepancy reports that Cates filed and then amended, everything Jesse gave me and everything I've documented since. He looked at Marsh with the specific expression of a man who has stopped being afraid and is discovering what that feels like in real time. I'm sorry it took me this long. Marsh's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved through his face. Not the reasonable expression, not the calculation behind it, but something underneath both of those. Something rawer. The expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on was not what he thought it was, and is only now beginning to calculate the depth of the fall. He didn't answer it. Aldrich. The voice came from outside. A new voice, amplified slightly by the cold air that moved through the still open door, carrying from the direction of the parking lot, hard and official and aimed at the building. This is State Highway Patrol. We have units on the highway. Come out of the building." The timeline had collapsed. Marsh looked at the room. At Vance, who had come back inside at some point and was standing near the door with his arms loose at his sides, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time for this specific moment, and is content to let it arrive at its own pace. At Briggs, who had put the folders down and was simply watching. At Danny Reyes on the table, eyes open and tracking, present for this even if he couldn't stand for it yet. At Maisie, who had climbed down from the booth again and was standing at Clara's left side, with her hand in her mother's hand and her father's patch around her neck, and the purple crayon still in her right fist. Marsh looked at the child for a long moment. Whatever he saw there, whatever a man like Marsh sees when he looks at what his actions cost, at the specific shape of the consequence standing in front of him in a 6-year-old's face, whatever he saw, it did not improve his expression. His security men were looking at each other. The assessor had taken a step toward the door. "Don't," Briggs said. Not loud, just the word, dropped into the room with the weight of someone who is very certain it will be sufficient. The assessor stopped. Outside, a sound was building that had nothing to do with the approaching law enforcement. Clara heard it before she understood it, low and rhythmic and multiplying, coming from the highway direction but from multiple points, converging on the diner's location with the specific synchronization of people who have been waiting for a signal and have received it. The sound of engines. Harley engines. The unmistakable deep percussion of them, not 1 or 2 or 10, but many more than that, rolling in from the dark through the blizzard from the direction of Widow Creek, and from the highway south, and from somewhere east of town. The sound building on itself until it filled the parking lot, and the lot filled with light. Headlights, dozens of them, illuminating the snow and the diner and Marsh's vehicles in the specific geometry of a perimeter that has been closed. Clara went to the window. The lot was full. Every space, every approach corridor, every gap between the existing motorcycles now occupied, the arrivals still coming, still rolling in from the dark, shutting down one by one until the engines quieted in sequence and the headlights stayed on, and what remained was light and silence, and the specific weight of more than 100 men sitting on motorcycles in a Montana blizzard at 2 in the morning and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Vance stood beside her. "You called them," she said. "Briggs did. While you were on the phone." He looked at the lot. "They were coming anyway. Once the word went out that we were down, they were already moving. We just told them where." "From where?" "Everywhere." He said it simply. Billings, Great Falls, Bozeman, Missoula. The chapter in Havre drove in from the north. That's 4 hours in this weather. He paused. Some of them rode through the worst of this storm to get here. She looked at the headlights, at the shapes of men on bikes, still and silent and present in the snow. "Not for you," she said. "Not an accusation, an understanding." "No," Vance said, "for Jesse." The front door opened again. State Highway Patrol, 2 officers, both in uniform, both carrying the careful officiousness of people who have arrived into a situation they were briefed on, but whose full dimensions are still resolving in front of them. They looked at the room. They looked at Marsh. The senior officer, female, somewhere in her 40s, with the face of someone who has been doing this long enough to recognize the shape of a situation without needing it explained, looked at Clara. "Mrs. Rowan?" "Yes." "Commander Rosser sends her regards. She's 20 minutes out." She looked at Marsh. "Mr. Marsh, my understanding is you have questions to answer regarding a county assessor's order issued under potentially compromised authority. Not aggressive. Procedural. The tone of someone who has been told enough to be here and is not yet showing everything she knows. I'm going to need you to step outside with me." Marsh looked at his phone again. At the lot full of motorcycles visible through the windows. "I want my attorney," he said. "You can call your attorney from outside." The officer's voice hadn't changed. "Right now I need you to step out." Marsh moved toward the door. His security men followed. The assessor went with them, faster than the others. The walk of someone who has understood the difference between a job he was told was routine and the thing it actually is, and who is currently recalculating every decision that led him here. The door swung shut. The room exhaled. Clara realized she'd been holding tension in her shoulders for so long that releasing it was almost painful, a slow burn through the muscles between her shoulder blades. the physical cost of the last 3 hours making itself known now that the immediate pressure had passed enough to allow it. She let it go, stood in the exhale. Maisie's hand was still in hers. "Mama," Maisie said, "I know, bug." "Is it over?" Clara looked at the folder on the counter, at Soren, who was sitting in a booth now with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands in the specific posture of someone discharging something they've been carrying for too long. At Briggs, who was on his phone, real signal now, the storm beginning to ease its grip on the cell towers, the first bars returning. At Danny Reyes, who had pushed himself upright on the table with Preach steadying him from behind, and who was looking around the room with the particular expression of someone who went down in the dark and has come up into a different version of everything. "Not yet," Clara said, "but close." She looked at Vance. "I was watching the window. Not the lot, but the highway beyond it, where the state patrol vehicles were pulling in and the red and blue light was beginning to paint the snow in rotating color, official and cold, and arriving in the specific way that authority arrives when it has finally been summoned by evidence rather than by money or by influence, or by the patience of a man who has spent decades believing that the right people can be made to look away long enough." His expression was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated than either, the expression of a man who has reached the end of a very long road and is only now beginning to understand that the road had a cost he'd been paying without knowing, and that some of what he owed wasn't to the living. He looked at Clara. She looked back. Between them was Jesse Rowan, not spoken, not gestured toward, not made explicit. Just present in the space between them the way people are present after they are gone, in the decisions they made, and the things they documented, and the strangers they pulled from burning vehicles on August highways, and the daughters they left behind with leather patches around their necks, and mothers who were too stubborn to close the diner. "When this is processed," Vance said. His voice was quiet, directed only at her. "When the charges against me are cleared and the fund is recovered and the documentation is in the AG's hands, there's money that belongs to you, 3 years of it, and what we should have done 3 years ago, which is make sure you knew we existed and that you weren't alone with this." She looked at him. "I don't need. It's not about need." He said it firmly, but not hard. "Jesse saved my men. We dishonored that by trusting the wrong person with the obligation it created. The money is yours. It always was. What we do with what's left after that is your call entirely, and we will abide by it." He paused. "I'm just asking you to let us do what we should have done." She thought about the propane bill, the bank calls, the $42 and change in the register, 3 years of Maisie eating cereal for dinner twice a week so that there was enough for the mortgage, and Clara not telling her why, because 6-year-olds should not carry the weight of financial ruin. She thought about Jesse sitting at the kitchen table with his files. "There's a condition," she said. "Name it. I want his name on whatever record comes out of this, not mine. His, Jesse Rowan, civil engineer contractor, the man who documented the conspiracy and was killed before he could report it." She looked at Vance. "I don't want him to be a footnote. He had a name and he knew what he was doing when he built that file, and I want the AG's report to say so clearly." Vance held her gaze. "That is the minimum we owe him," he said. The second state patrol vehicle was pulling into the lot when Danny Reyes said from the table, "Somebody want to tell me what I missed?" Preach looked down at him. "Everything," he said. "That's what I was afraid of." Danny's voice was rough and thin, but present, genuinely, fully present, the voice of someone climbing back up from a very cold, dark place and finding that the world at the top of the climb is different than the one he left. He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, I heard what you did when we came in. You weren't conscious. I came in and out." He looked at his hands, which were warmer now and steadier than they'd been. "I heard you tell them how to warm me. Heard your daughter and the blankets." He looked at the patch around Maisie's neck. His expression changed, not dramatically, just a small and private shift, like something recognizing something it wasn't expecting to find. "Your husband's?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What was he like?" The question arrived without ceremony or preparation, the straightforward curiosity of a young man who had been unconscious for a portion of a very consequential night, and was filling in the pieces with the instinct of someone trying to understand what he'd been saved into. Clara looked at the patch, at her daughter, wearing it. "He was the kind of person," she said slowly, who couldn't drive past a problem he could do something about. Danny Reyes looked at that for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. I know that kind. Outside, the sound of the state patrol officer's voice reached them through the walls. Official, procedural, the language of a situation being formally documented and controlled. Marcia's voice responded, and then another voice she didn't recognize, and then silence. Then the radio. The CB in the kitchen burst to life. Not the three-word threat from before, but an open-channel transmission, official frequency. Commander Rosser's voice coming through clear and direct and close. Ashvow, this is Commander Rosser, State Highway Patrol. I have units on location, and I have the documentation package from the AG's duty officer. I need a representative to step out and speak with my lead officer. We're treating the condemnation order as suspended pending investigation of the issuing authority. You are not required to vacate the premises tonight. The room was silent for one full second. Then somebody at the back of the room, she never found out who, started clapping once, slowly, and stopped themselves immediately. Because the men in that room were not the kind of men who clapped, and the restraint of it was somehow more complete than any celebration would have been. Vance looked at Clara. She looked at the window. The headlights from more than 100 motorcycles were still burning in the snow, patient and still and bright, the light of them casting the parking lot in a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. She thought, I should go out there. I should speak with the officers. I should deal with what comes next. She thought, Jesse. Jesse knew, 3 years ago, and he was going to do something about it, and they killed him before he could. And now here is where that ends. In my parents' diner on a Tuesday night, in a Montana blizzard with our daughter in my hand and his files on the counter, and more than 100 men sitting in the snow because he pulled 11 strangers off burning bikes on an August highway and never asked for anything in return. She thought, some debts don't resolve, they transform. She looked at Vance. Tell Commander Rosser I'll be out in a minute, she said. He nodded and went to the CB. Clara crouched down in front of Maisie. Eye level. The way it needed to be done. Maisie looked at her with Jesse's eyes. She'd always had Jesse's eyes, the exact shade and the exact quality of directness in them. The looking at you completely that had made her fall in love with Jesse Rowan at a kitchen table in a house that no longer belonged to them. Are we okay? Maisie asked. Clara put both hands on her daughter's face. We are, she said. We are going to be. Maisie considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything that deserved seriousness. Then she looked at the window, at the lights. All those people came for Dad, she said. Yes, because he helped them. Because he helped them. Maisie was quiet for a moment, her small hand coming up to touch the leather patch at her throat, the worn stitching, the cracked leather that had survived 3 years around the neck of a 6-year-old, because Clara had kept rethreading the cord every time it frayed. I want to go outside and see them, she said. Clara looked at the lot, at the riders in the snow, at the state patrol vehicles in the red and blue light, and Marsh, somewhere in the dark, being asked questions by someone who had finally been given enough reason to ask them. She stood up. She took Maisie's hand. She pushed open the front door of the copper kettle and walked out into the blizzard with her daughter beside her, and the cold hit them both immediately and completely, and the headlights of more than 100 motorcycles lit them up in the parking lot of her dead parents' diner on Highway 12 in Widow Creek, Montana. And for a moment, one suspended, weightless, complete moment. Nobody moved and nobody spoke, and the storm blew past them, and the lights held steady, and Clara Rowan understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the first night of what came after. Behind her, through the open door, she heard Danny Reyes say to Preach, "Help me up, I want to stand up." And Preach said, "You sure?" And Danny said, "Yeah." And that was the sound of it. Not victory, not resolution, not the clean, satisfying click of a story closing. Just a young man deciding he was ready to stand, and someone who'd been watching over him making sure he could. Clara squeezed Maisie's hand. Maisie squeezed back. The lights held. The storm broke at 4 in the morning. Not gradually, the way Montana storms sometimes unwound themselves over hours, loosening their grip degree by degree until you almost didn't notice the change. This one simply stopped, the way it had arrived. All at once, a decision made somewhere above the cloud line, and then the snow was just falling instead of driving, and the wind dropped from a roar to a murmur, and the highway became visible again in the gray pre-dawn light, empty and white and absolutely still. Clara noticed it from inside the diner, where she had been sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee she'd stopped drinking an hour ago, and a state investigator named Pruitt, who had the methodical patience of someone who understood that a witness's account was only as good as the care taken to receive it. He had a recorder and a legal pad, and he did not rush her through any of it. He let her tell it in the order it had happened, from the headlights in the blizzard, to Maisie at the window, to the CB radio, to Jessie's folder in the filing cabinet. And when she finished, he read back 3 sections for confirmation and thanked her in the flat professional way of a man who has heard terrible things before and has learned that the worst thing you can do to someone who has survived them is perform emotion you don't actually feel. Aldrich Marsh had been transported to the State Patrol facility in Billings before midnight. His son Teller, identified through Maisie's crayon drawing and the junction box footage and a security camera at a gas station 12 miles east of Widow Creek that had caught his plates at the right time, was picked up at a motel in Bozeman at 2 in the morning. Harold Cates had tried to reach Galveston before the phone lines could be flagged and had instead reached Commander Rosser's duty officer, which was the kind of mistake that men who have operated without consequence for too long reliably make when consequence finally arrives. They reach for the tools that have always worked and don't understand yet that those tools have been removed. Galveston had not been reached. Galveston had been smart enough to be unreachable, which Investigator Pruitt noted without expression as something the AG's office was already addressing through channels that did not require Galveston's cooperation. The misappropriation charges against Vance had been formally suspended pending review at 3:47 in the morning. Pruitt had told Clara about that in passing, as context, and she had watched it land on Vance from across the room. The slight change in his shoulders, the single exhale, the way he set down the coffee he was holding and picked it back up and said nothing. Kevin Soren had given a 7-hour recorded statement to a second investigator in the back office. He'd sat in there from midnight onward, and when he came out at 3:30, his face had the washed-out quality of someone who has said everything they've been holding and is still adjusting to the absence of its weight. He sat in a corner booth by himself, and nobody bothered him, and Preach brought him coffee without being asked, and that was the full extent of the comfort that was offered. And it was, Clara thought, exactly the right amount. Danny Reyes had been moved from the long table to a proper booth once he was stable enough to sit upright on his own. He had eaten 2 pieces of toast and a bowl of soup that Clara had made in the kitchen at 1 in the morning, because the kitchen was something she could control, and controlling something mattered when everything else was in other people's hands. He had eaten both without speaking much, and when he was done, he had looked at the leather patch around Maisie's neck. She had fallen asleep in the booth beside him, her head on his good arm, the crayon still loosely in her hand. And he had sat very still with her sleeping against him for a long time, careful not to wake her. Clara had watched that from the counter and had not said anything, because there was nothing to say that the image didn't already contain. At 5 in the morning, as the light outside shifted from black to the specific gray-blue of a winter dawn, making its cautious appearance after a night like this one, Vance sat down at the counter beside her. She refilled her coffee, refilled his without asking. They sat for a moment in the quiet of a room where most people were finally sleeping, riders in booths, riders on the floor with jackets under their heads, Briggs in a chair by the front door that he'd pulled to face the entrance and hadn't left for 3 hours, technically sleeping, but in the way that certain men sleep when they're on guard, 1 level below the surface. "The Rowan Foundation," Vance said. She looked at him. "I want to bring it to the table formally, not as something we do for you, as something we do with you." He held the coffee cup in both hands. "There are families on this highway, and every highway like it, who lose people to infrastructure failures, to contract fraud, to the kind of deliberate negligence that costs nothing until it costs everything. Jessie knew that. I was trying to do something about it before he was stopped." He paused. "The foundation carries his name. It operates independently. You have full authority over what it funds and who it serves. We provide the initial capital and whatever operational support you need. After that, it belongs to you and to whoever you build it with." Clara looked at the counter, at the grain of the wood her father had sanded down and refinished 3 times over 20 years because he believed in maintaining things properly. "That's a large offer," she said. "It's a long overdue obligation," he said, "dressed up as an offer because you're the kind of person who won't accept obligation." She looked at him sideways. He looked at his coffee. "Jessie went back into that fire twice," Vance said. Two of the men he pulled out are alive today and have families because of that. One of them has a daughter who started college last fall. He set the cup down. I think about that sometimes. The specific arithmetic of it. What one person's decision to not look away produces over time, in lives they never know they touched. He was quiet for a moment. Your husband understood something about the world that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid understanding, because understanding it is expensive. It killed him, Clara said. Flat. Not bitter. Just accurate in the way she'd learned to hold accurate things. Yes, Vance said. It did. The flatness of that, the refusal to soften it or reframe it or make it mean something cleaner than what it was the thing she trusted most about him. She'd spent 3 years being offered reframings by people who meant well and couldn't bear the plainness of what had happened. The plainness, in her experience, was the only part of it she could actually live with. I'll think about the foundation, she said. That's all I'm asking. The front door opened. Not intruding. Briggs had it before whoever was outside finished pushing, and the exchange at the door was brief and quiet and ended with Briggs stepping back to let a single rider through, a woman in her 40s with an ash vow support cut and road-red cheeks, and the look of someone who had driven a very long way through very bad conditions and was not interested in discussing how bad they were. She went directly to Vance, handed him an envelope. He opened it, read what was inside, and then set it face down on the counter. He put his hand flat on top of it. He breathed once through his nose. The fund accounts are unfrozen, he said. Galveston's access has been revoked, and the AG's office has a forensic accountant going through 3 years of transfers. He kept his hand on the envelope. The shortfall, what should have reached you over 3 years, is recoverable. Pruitt will have the specifics, but the estimate is that the full amount plus interest can be moved within 30 days pending the formal case proceedings. Clara looked at the envelope she couldn't see. She thought about the propane bill. The bank calls she hadn't answered because she already knew what they were going to say. The cereal dinners. The sign above the copper kettle that she'd been meaning to have repainted for 2 years and kept deferring because $42 in a register didn't leave room for signs. She thought about her father refinishing the counter, about her mother running this diner through 2 recessions and a bad winter that had closed the highway for a week, and a fire in the kitchen that had taken 6 months to repair, and a decade of $40 days, and still never once, to Clara's knowledge, considered closing it. Thank you, she said. It was 2 words, and they were insufficient, and she meant them completely. At 6 in the morning, the riders began to leave. Not all at once, in ones and twos, the way a fire disperses, each departure quiet and without ceremony. They had slept in her diner and eaten her food and stood in her parking lot in a blizzard for reasons that began with Jessie Rowan and had grown, over the course of one night, into something she didn't have an adequate name for. They left the way they'd arrived, with the economy of people who don't make more of things than the things require. A few of them stopped at the counter before they went, said something brief, used her name or didn't, shook her hand or nodded or just held eye contact for a moment with the specific directness of people acknowledging that something real had happened here, and then went. The big bearded man who had crouched down to Maisie's level and asked for the soft blanket stopped in front of her on his way to the door. He stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "The soup was good. When you're up and running full again." He looked at the diner. "I'll bring my wife." She nodded. He went. Danny Reyes was the last of the riders to leave, and he didn't leave alone. Preach waited for him, kept the pace slow, didn't make it obvious that he was keeping the pace slow. At the door, Danny stopped and turned back to where Maisie was finally awake and sitting in the booth eating the toast Clara had made her with the same focused seriousness she brought to all breakfast foods. "Hey," Danny said. Maisie looked up. "The patch." He touched his own collar, indicating the position where the patch hung on her. "Your dad wore that." "I know," Maisie said. "He was—" Danny stopped, started again. "He was the kind of person who should still be here." He said it with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to soften true things. And in this instance, Clara was grateful for that because it was exactly true and exactly what it cost. "I'm sorry he's not." Maisie considered this with her full attention. "Me too," she said. Then, "But you're here." Danny Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. The same thing that had moved through Briggs's face at the booth with the crayon drawing, through the bearded man's face at the blanket question, through Vance's face when he first saw the patch. The specific fracture in the construction that certain people build over certain kinds of damage, when something small and true and unguarded makes direct contact with what's underneath. He didn't say anything else. He nodded once at Maisie and once at Clara, and then he and Preach went through the door. Clara stood at the window and watched the last bikes pull out of the lot. The snow was 6 inches deep and unmarked now except for the tracks of the departures, the parallel lines of tire treads leading back toward the highway in the pale early light. The Harley sound faded degrees, from immediate to distant to ambient to gone, swallowed by the ordinary morning silence of a highway after a storm. That specific quiet that is not emptiness, but the absence of violence, which in its own way is a kind of peace. Vance was the last to go. He stood at the door with his jacket zipped and his cut over it, and the headlamp gone from his forehead, looking like someone who had arrived 4 hours ago through a blizzard carrying a dying young man and had left something here that he hadn't planned to and was only now calculating what that meant. "The foundation," he said, "when you're ready." "When I'm ready," she said. He looked at Maisie, who was watching him with her father's eyes over the rim of her juice glass. "Your dad would have liked knowing you were here," he said to her. Simple. Direct. The economy of a man who doesn't have surplus words and doesn't spend the ones he has on things he doesn't mean. Maisie put down the juice glass. "Did you know him?" she asked. "Really know him?" "No," Vance said. "I knew what he did. That's different." He looked at Clara. "But I think, from what I've seen tonight, I know where he came from." He went through the door. Clara stood at the window and watched him cross the lot to the last motorcycle. A dark Harley, road-worn, no chrome showmanship, just the functional iron of something that has been a long way and intends to go further. He started it. The sound of it in the silent lot was the sound of something real, substantial, alive in the cold morning air. He sat for a moment, just sat, on the idling bike in the empty lot with his hands on the bars and the snow beginning to settle on his shoulders. Then he pulled out, onto Highway 12, and the sound of the engine went east and faded and was gone. Clara stayed at the window for a while after. The copper kettle was quiet around her in the way it had always been quiet in the early morning before she turned on the lights and started the coffee and began the particular daily negotiation of keeping a thing alive through sheer refusal to let it stop. The booths needed wiping. The floor needed mopping. There were borrowed tablecloths piled in the corner that she'd need to launder. The sign above the door needed repainting. She would get to all of it. She turned from the window. Maisie was at the counter now, having migrated from the booth with her toast and her juice and her spiral notebook, and she was drawing again, sharp purple crayon, fresh page, working with the focused absorption of someone with a clear image in her mind and the intention to capture it before it fades. Clara came around the counter and stood beside her and looked at the drawing. It was motorcycles, dozens of them, rendered in the loose interpretive style of a 6-year-old who draws what things feel like rather than what they look like. Round headlights and wide handlebars and figures on their backs that were more impression than anatomy. The lot outside the diner, from above, from the angle of a child looking down at something that filled her field of vision, all those lights in the snow. "That's really good," Clara said. Maisie didn't look up from the crayon. "I know," she said, with the serene confidence of someone who has not yet learned to undervalue her own work. Clara put her hand on her daughter's back, felt the small, solid warmth of her, the living weight of the most important thing Jessie Rowan had ever left behind. She thought about the foundation, about the families on every highway, like this one, who lost people to things that should have been prevented, about the specific arithmetic of what one person's refusal to look away produces over time, in lives they never know they touched. She thought about Jesse at the kitchen table with his files, about the 14 emails to a man who hadn't answered, about the guardrail at Sawmill Creek Curve, and the 6 weeks between the last email and the accident, and the 3 years between the accident and this morning when she finally understood what those 6 weeks had contained. She thought, he couldn't have known it would go this way. He couldn't have known any of it. He just knew he had the files and the evidence and a number for the Attorney General's office, and that was enough to make him move. She thought, that's all it was. Just that. Just the refusal to have the information and do nothing with it. The coffee was done. She could smell it from where she stood, the specific smell of the copper kettle's morning, her mother's blend, the same she'd been using for 3 years because changing it had never seemed like a thing she was ready to do. She poured a cup. She looked at the diner, at the familiar worn spaces of it, the crack in the corner booth vinyl she'd been meaning to repair, the photograph of her parents on the wall behind the register, the specials board with yesterday's specials still on it in her handwriting. She looked at the sign above the door, the one that needed repainting. She would repaint it. She would repaint it with the diner's name in clean new letters, and she would fix the booth vinyl, and she would call Margaret Oakes in the morning to discuss the legal structure of a foundation and what it needed to function and who else might sit on its board, and she would answer the bank's calls now that there was something real to say when she answered them. She would do all of it. But first she stood in the quiet of the copper kettle in the early light of a morning after a storm, with her daughter drawing motorcycles at the counter and the coffee getting hot, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not lonely, not the silence of a woman running out of time and road. A different silence. The silence of something that had been tested at its absolute limit and had not broken, and was still here, and was warm, and smelled like coffee, and had a child in it drawing light in the snow. Outside, Highway 12 ran east and west under a sky that was clearing for the first time in days, the clouds pulling back to show the first clean blue of morning at the edges. The road was empty. The lot was empty. The tire tracks in the snow led away from the diner in every direction, north, south, east, west, the record of more than 100 men who had come here in the dark and stood in the cold and gone again before dawn. They had not asked for anything. They had not left a bill. On the counter beside Maisie's drawing was a single folded note, plain paper, no envelope, written in the compressed practical handwriting of someone not given to long letters. Clara opened it. It read, "The copper kettle stays open. Ash Vow MC below that," in different handwriting, smaller and slightly unsteady, as if written by someone who'd recently been very cold and was still finding their hands. "Thank you for the soft blanket, Dr." Clara folded the note, put it in her apron pocket, poured a second cup of coffee she didn't need because the act of pouring it felt like the right thing to do, and set it on the counter beside the drawing. She reached out and straightened the photograph of her parents on the wall. Then she went to the specials board and erased yesterday's offerings and picked up the chalk. She wrote slowly, deliberately, in the clean block letters her mother had used for 20 years on this board, in this diner, on this highway. She wrote, "Today's special. Whatever we have. You're welcome here." She set down the chalk. She looked at the board. She looked at her daughter, who had added one more detail to the drawing, a small figure standing in the lot beside the motorcycles, looking up at all the light. A small figure with a patch around its neck. "Mama," Maisie said, without looking up from the crayon. "Yeah, Bug. Can we keep the diner open today, even though it's early?" Clara looked at the door, at the highway beyond it, going east and west into the cleared morning. "Yeah," she said, "we can." She went to the door and turned the sign, open. The morning light came through the windows of the copper kettle and fell across the counter and the booths and the worn floor and the photograph on the wall and the drawing of 100 motorcycles in the snow, and somewhere out on Highway 12, getting smaller with distance and growing quieter by the mile. The last engine faded into the kind of silence that isn't the absence of something, but the presence of something that has passed through and left the world changed and moved on without asking to be remembered for it. Some protectors are like that. They come through the dark, and they stand in the cold, and they go before the light finds them. And the warmth they leave behind is the only monument they want.